behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all our colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. For those of you who have missed our earlier sessions, including the wonderful Jhumpa Lahiri, Peter Carey, Tina Brown, Shashi Tharoor, Shubha Mudgal, and so many others, you may catch these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. To tell you more about the brilliant writers that we have lined up for you, please welcome Festival Directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple.
We are all of us so absolutely delighted by the enthusiastic response from around the world to our stellar new series, JLF, Brave New World. We look at the new life that all of us have to begin, the journey ahead, the learnings, the unlearnings through these sessions on books, on ideas, on mechanisms to cope with and to understand how things are turning around after the pandemic. I urge all of you to listen in to us, to engage with us, to send your suggestions, and to join the Brave New World.
Hi there, we've put together an incredible literary festival for you online, JLF Brave New World. All the writers we love most at Jaipur, Peter Frankopan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Margaret Atwood, have been joined by a whole galaxy of stars we've never dreamt of actually getting to the festival. People like Peter Carey, Evan Duval, Alain de Botton. It's an incredible lineup. Orhan Pamuk, Neil Gaiman, really, it just goes on and on and on. Come and join us, Brave New World, every Wednesday, Saturday and Sunday evening on a phone or laptop near you.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, William. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our session today on JLF's Brave New World is Crown of Thorns, Compassion in the Times of Corona. A conversation with New Zealand-based writer, researcher, surgeon and physician, Dr. Sharad Paul, and he'll talk about the need for clear-eyed thinking and compassionate leadership and the medical and human dimensions of the pandemic. Dr. Sharad Paul is the author of The Genetics of Health and Skin, a biography. He's also a skin cancer specialist, family physician, skincare expert, evolutionary biologist, storyteller, social entrepreneur, and an adjunct professor at Auckland's University of Technology. Dr. Paul was awarded New Zealand Medical Association's highest award. In 2008, he was featured in international editions of Time and the New Zealand Herald. In 2015, he was awarded the prestigious Ko Avatia International Excellence Award for leading health improvement on a global scale. Please remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section. Do also follow our handles JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, and there have been many, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, Crown of Thorns, a conversation with Dr. Sharad Paul. Sharad, welcome all the way from New Zealand. How have you been and what's the status in New Zealand?
Very good. Thank you for having me. New Zealand, I think our relative geographical isolation helps us. So we've got about 1,400 cases of COVID-19 and about 20 deaths. And very similar trajectory. Australia's probably got about 6,000 cases and they're a larger population. So I think we both are tracking very similarly.
And tell me, Sharad, is this a rich man's disease which has been brought in on flights, etc.?
I think it's easier for pandemics to spread now because of air travel. There's no doubt about it. I don't know if it's a rich man's disease, but it's spread through our interconnectedness. So if you look at SARS in 2003, or even let me give you an example. Before that, actually, in 1999, there was the Nipah virus in Malaysia, which I think in Kerala, they've made a movie I heard called Virus, which is based on the Nipah. And we'll talk about pandemics later, but that didn't spread a lot for two reasons. The more lethal the virus is, the less they can spread, obviously, because you're killing too many hosts. So this one has a fine balance because it has a mortality rate generally around 2.5%. We're so interconnected, and it travels by large droplets. So therefore, it's on contact with surfaces. So if you think about it, you sneeze or cough and it lands on a surface on your aircraft, it lasts for like 3 days. So literally, or on any other surface, the airports, and we're so interconnected now, even more so than we were 20 years ago. And you can actually see a clear link with places like Wuhan, for example, has very close contacts with Italy in trade, because apparently a lot of their luxury goods are manufactured in Wuhan, right? So whereas in New Zealand, our links are to different parts of China, we had not even really, to be honest, heard of Wuhan before this happened. So really, I think you can see the interconnectedness, travel. If you look at the United States, last year, the internal and external airports carried 1 billion passengers. If you think about all that, it's inevitable that it's going to go global. And less and less connected places. So that's why we don't have it much in the Pacific Islands, because they don't have flights coming in and out.
Sharad, what everybody's been saying is that the coronavirus is quite unique in the way that it's been able to adapt and change. Is that true? And does it have an innate intelligence built into it?
I think all viruses do to some degree, or all microbes do. I think you have to stop and think about, firstly, everything works on natural selection. So you have to think like a virus. So if you think like a virus, then you are thinking, how do I actually spread? So for a start, you don't want to be. So the mutations are based on density, in my view, to a large degree. And this has been a bit overlooked. So for example, what I'm trying to get at is, let's just say you were in a school bus and you were in a place where there were only 5 kids in a school bus. If you infected all of them and you kill them all, then you have no future yourself as a virus. So generally in more sparsely populated places like New Zealand or Australia or Iceland or whatever, you can even say Germany, that you may find that our death rates are lower, because also our incidence is much lower. Density, the virulence of the virus rather, is lower. Whereas in places which have lots of people, it can be more virulent because it can afford to actually kill more people. And I think, so that's how viruses mutate. What's interesting with these is actually the mutation rates for COVID is not higher than many other viruses, but it's very typical of this kind of a coronavirus. They generally mutate, but the mutations are what we call stable mutations, which means they're not really changing dramatically, but they're changing just subtly.
So, Sharad, you were talking about New Zealand and the fact that because New Zealand is so far away and less densely populated, the virus has had a limited effect. If we go on to the effect that it's had in Europe, and we've seen the devastation in the Spains and the Italys and the United Kingdom, but yet places like Germany, Sweden, and Iceland, for example, have been great examples where they've been able to contain it, and with very different ways of tackling it. I mean, Sweden, for example, has not had lockdown in the way that we've had in India or you've had in New Zealand to some extent. Can you tell us what's the difference, and perhaps also sort of crystal gaze and look back and tell us what should be the most effective way of controlling a virus going forward? Because today's pandemic is, of course, Corona, but we know that there are pandemics now more and more possible given the devastation caused by COVID-19.
So firstly, the interesting thing about it is that medicine and humanity hasn't really learned from past pandemics, because we are not really intuitive beings. So we don't really look out for dangers which we don't see within our vision. So every time a pandemic comes, we're unprepared. But what I was finding interesting is The Crown of Thorns, the title we chose, was really on a new book I'm writing on pandemics and this one. And really, one of the things was, if you look at the plague in 1300s, which killed 50% of Europe, basically it came from rat-infested and flea-infested rats from ships. Again, it was because of interconnectedness from trade. They were bringing grain from Egypt and here and there, and rats were infested with fleas. And then when the rats die, the rats infect humans because they're in close proximity. And what people had thought was, they thought that, okay, 2 weeks it takes for the rats to get rat colony to be fully infected. And then apparently the fleas then fast for about 2 to 3 days before they look for new hosts. And humans were conveniently located on the ships. So, and then it took 6 days for humans to get infected. So when people calculated all this, they came up with 30 days where you should be in isolation. And that was called Trentino, because in Italian, it has 30. And then people thought, hang on, if you just said 30, you have to put the fear of God in people, or people don't believe something unless there's something, but they believe if you say God. So they thought Lent is 40 days, Jesus went away for 40 days. Historically, in religious things, 40 days is a well-known thing. So then they changed this Trentino to Quarantino, which became 40 days. And that's really where quarantine comes from. So if you look at the history, it's always been social isolating people, separating, avoiding contact, washing hands. I mean, I looked at a 1918 Spanish flu poster in the Los Angeles Times, very old edition in an archive, and it has 3 things. The poster says, spit kills, wash hands, stay home, avoid social contact. I mean, that's literally the message we're giving 100 years later. So the funny thing is not a lot has happened different, because it's a new virus and we don't have any natural immunity yet. Now let's go, the interesting thing you raised is Sweden. We'll come to Sweden in a minute, but Sweden is actually slightly interesting because they themselves every now and then vacillate between, are we on the right path or not? Because they've had a high death rate. So for example, Sweden, when I last looked, they've had about, I think, 15,000 cases or something like that, but they've had something like over 1,500 deaths. If you compare Norway, the neighbor, which is in full lockdown, because I was just speaking to a surgeon friend of mine in Norway, and they've been constantly checking on Sweden, they've had not maybe half the number of cases, but they've had only 250 deaths. So calculating for population, because Sweden's about twice, Norway should have had maybe 500, but Sweden's, I think, sitting at 2,500, something like that, maybe 5 times. So what he was saying is they're being foolish because they're losing a lot of older people. So but the Sweden's argument is, if you look at the overall death rate for a year, those people were unhealthy, and at some point they were going to die. This probably hastens it. So they're taking almost like a eugenic type of thing, they were going to die anyway kind of an approach. But Germany is different. See, Germany has certain interesting things. Is, for a start off with, the most Germans who were infected were young people because they were travelers. See, Germans travel a lot backpacking. They were on ski holidays in Italy, here and there. So most of the average age of infection in Germany was something between 20 and 50. The average age in Italy and Spain was older people. And the second thing we must consider is European cities. If you compare with cities like our cities here, our public transport is rubbish because we're so spread apart. Whereas in Europe, you look at the beautiful metros, everyone's traveling close proximity. If you're in Italy and Spain, you're always hugging. Every time I go to Italy, we're kissing on both cheeks. So it's literally, the close physical contact. And I think the real reason why Italy and Spain suffered is they have large older populations. They live interconnected, like in India, more joint kind of families. The other thing is that the virus was there earlier than people realized. It was probably already there in January because of the close links between Wuhan and Italy, but nobody even knew it. And this was a time when even the WHO was saying, there's this virus. We can't call it a pandemic yet, but, it may be mild. So nobody was really, and Iceland is slightly different because Iceland is very low population. It has only 300,000 people, right? In New Zealand, we have 5 million. So Iceland's less than a tenth of our size. I've been to Iceland, and the other thing is Iceland also has a very good public health system, same as New Zealand. So the key to this is, when a pandemic strikes and you don't have any natural immunity, the key is how good your public health system is. And Iceland actually suffered very badly in the 1918 pandemic. And when I visited Iceland and we discussed this, they actually used that as a model to develop their preparedness for a pandemic. Because our islands, you see, islands have an advantage. Like, you simply can seal your borders and nobody can come on, right? We don't have land borders like, say, America or India does. So Iceland has an advantage. But on the other hand, they also have very good trace and track system. And the other thing they did is they started testing virtually everybody. Like if you look at Iceland, I think per million population, they've done, I think 130,000 or something like that. They're just testing a significant proportion of the population. But that's given us insights into asymptomatic areas. So 0.3 to 0.8% of the population carry the virus. In general, you don't know you have it and you give it to other people.
Wow. You talked about something very, very interesting. You talked about man's intuitive nature and his unpreparedness to be able to deal with. Is that part of our genetic makeup, that we tend to be unprepared, and we've been unprepared over millennia for something or the other, and yet many of our religious philosophies sort of try and prepare you for the ultimate. So where is that sort of dichotomy between unpreparedness and our intuitive nature?
I think partly because humans, as we evolved, we started to see, we populated the planet because of cooperation rather than conflict. Like, contrary to what people think, it's because people thought if we hunt in pairs, we're rather to be more successful if we fought together. So really, when human beings came out of Africa only 100,000 years ago, and in 100,000 years later, we've made many creatures extinct, but we've populated every corner of the world. So in this feeling of, grandiosity, or feeling that we are superior, we are naturally optimists. So we think nothing's going to happen to us, we're going to be fine. But in actual fact, so we're not really prepared any more than a dinosaur was prepared when something struck, because we don't think of the possibilities. Like, how many people think, what is the possibility of comet hitting us, or what? Because it's not in a reality. But if you look at the real dangers, artificial intelligence, we may not be able to control it soon. Super bugs, we may not be able to control them. All these things are very real. Like, so in Oxford, when I was there last, there is an institute for future humanity, and they calculate the risk with especially AI and superbugs and nuclear war. The odds of human extinction during this century is 1 in 6. It's like playing Russian roulette. But we don't think that, because we think we can carry on the way we're going. Global warming, let the planet warm, we'll burn more fuel. So we're not actually intuitive.
But Sharad, yet you've advocated that it's actually the scaredy cat that's inhabited or continued in the planet. Tell us
the scaredy cat.
That.
Yeah. So that's what's interesting, is the scaredy cat genes. The more of us have scaredy cat genes, so we are alarmist about small things we see and do, but we're not for the things which are unseen. See, because most predators were seen, right? You saw a tiger and you ran. So the people who ran, more of them survived compared to the guys who went and fought the battles. So today, more of us carry the anxiety gene. So it is true that most of us also have it's both sides, it's like a double-edged sword. We do have an anxiety gene, but we are also natural optimists. So we think we're going to do better than any other creature, but also we think that we own the planet. But the fact is, the virus or bacteria, they can't give us stuff, because if you think, do we even realize that portion of our body already carries viruses and bacteria? So when you estimate the human genome, 43%, we are only 43% human. 57%, the rest of us is actually microbial genes. So, everything evolved and one on top of each other. So we actually have some viruses, we have bacteria. This is actually part of our own inherent genetic makeup. And I think this is what we don't realize. So even if we take a genome and dissect it out, we're only 43% human.
Wow. So coming back to the virus, and in this case, COVID-19, obviously the testing and the DNA trail has now given us much more information about it and the different versions of it, etc., that we see. But tell us, what I just recently read is that the virus could actually be penetrating through our nasal passages rather than what was earlier looked at, that the first point was the throat. Can you tell us how this sort of information is now come through? And what's the stage of inquiry into the existing virus?
I think we know certain things. When any pandemic comes, there's always naturally a lot of conspiracy theories and things like that. But we know this much is true. We know that it didn't come because of 5G, which was a big conspiracy theory. We know that it's also natural selection. Like, we can see this virus has changed over time from bats over 20 years. So in other words, what it means is that this virus actually evolved naturally. And it possibly recombined with another virus, which was either found in pangolins. But my thing, which hasn't come out a lot in the media, is my suspicion actually, see, industrialized farming has a much higher risk than just wild animals. So raccoons in China and Asia are farmed. And raccoons also carry these coronaviruses. And so I actually think personally that it's a recombination of a bat virus and probably either pangolin or raccoon virus. So it's like you can see the genetic pattern sort of merging and forming a new strain, which was then able to penetrate humans. But the reason I call it the crown of thorns is because the outside of this virus has a crown. It's called corona because it means crown, because it's actually got these spikes. And these spikes basically what we call the spike protein, and that sort of attaches itself to your cell. And it literally opens like a trapdoor, so through which the DNA can come in. And then it can reproduce using your own cellular machinery. And then because it reproduces in you, your cell bursts, and then it spreads. So it comes on contact. So you can touch your face, and that's why everybody's been on about don't touch your face, because yes, through the nasal passages, now we're finding it's causing blood clots because it enters the blood system. So the idea is it just reproduces in your cells. So it gets into your cells and bursts them. So wherever it can get in, it's going to be infectious. But
you're talking about other vaccines, Sharad. So one of the theories that have been going around, and it's been in the papers and some of the research things, is that in India, for example, or those countries where people have been given the BCG vaccination, the effect of the virus has been perhaps less devastating than it has been in the other places. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of riders with it. So firstly, many vaccines, BCG and say measles is another one, good example, have a thing called, they have an immune effect beyond their own. So they stimulate the immune system. So for example, in countries where children have had the measles vaccine, what they found when measles vaccination became widespread was not only did these children not get measles, but they got less coughs and colds and various other things. So it does protect you from other things just because it stimulates your immune system. So there's a degree of this with BCG, but there is a flaw in the study because this study actually came out of Africa. And what was interesting is the low birth weight infants are usually not given BCG because they think they won't handle it. So you exclude them. So therefore the study gets skewed because you only vaccinated the children who are not low birth weight. And then those children do worse anyway, because if you're low birth weight, you're more likely to get other infections anyway. So that's why that study actually scientifically at the moment, it's not proven, because what they didn't account for the fact was that the group which didn't have the BCG, there was a reason why they didn't get it. And that was because they were low birth weight, which means below a certain weight, they said, don't give the baby the BCG. So you can't actually extrapolate the two. See, India is interesting because we have the least number of tests done. Right. So when I looked at it today, I think per million in other countries, like I said, I spent 130,000. India was like 600. Every other country is like New Zealand is probably 14,000. Most average in Europe is between 10 and 20,000. So we're like 600. Yes, we have a large population, but we were still much, much, much lower than China. And I think speaking to some public health physicians and professors whom I knew from years ago, they're saying there's a large amount of underreporting as well, simply because, India, majority of people living in slums and here, and they don't have access to healthcare anyway. So I don't think we're actually seeing the true picture in India. So I don't actually believe we're any more immune because of BCG than anywhere else, but I certainly think there's underreporting. So, we've started a bit late, so I think 30,000 cases, the crux will be, see, when you're locked down and everyone's inside, you're not going to get the virus. It's when people come back out again and start moving, do you get the second tail? And that's really, the big question.
Well, there is a sense that in June, July is when we're going to peak, etc., and it's here to stay. But what has been true, we are also very skeptical about the reporting process here. But what is true is that the death rate has gone down surprisingly, and that's the latest figures because you can correlate that. But we'll come back to that in a second. Going back to what you earlier said, I think the big concern, what I take from what you said, is that this vaccine could well be a myth right now because there's no real sense that, like with the severe SARS, that you will be able to develop vaccine. So in crystal gazing, Sharad, if you look forward and you extrapolate the fact that just the polio vaccine, once it came, it still took about 3 decades to be able to be rolled out across the world to make the world polio free. How do you see this corona or COVID-19 playing itself out? And therefore, what do you think, in your point of view, what would be the most effective strategies for places that have a larger population or more congested population, be it Brazil or some of the African countries or India?
I think the first thing to understand is, this is where everybody is talking about the curve of pandemics and flattening the curve. I think one thing you have to understand is the virus, like we said, because of natural selection, everything else, also wants to live forever like humans, right? So every pandemic goes up and goes down. So if you did nothing, the pandemic is still going to burn itself out, but it's going to kill a lot of people because a significant amount of people will develop some level of immunity themselves, and then the recovered ones will have some level of immunity. So what I mean by,
you mean like the plague,
lasting
and
immunity,
like the plague?
So whatever you get, anything you get, once you've recovered, you have a degree of immunity, and that's why people in China, doctors were using plasma from recovered people to treat the severely ill, and that does work. But we don't know how long this lasts, so it doesn't mean you can't get it next year. But what's interesting is to look back 100 years ago to the Spanish flu pandemic. It was influenza, and that's the flu which is now as the normal flu, right? Vaccine came much later, and it killed 50 million people, all right? Of course, it was wartime and people were closer contact, but 50 million at that time was a much larger number than what we're talking about, if you extrapolate. But what did the virus do over time? It mellowed down and it became an everyday virus, which still kills a lot of people, like more than the deaths we've had from corona if you take globally. I mean, if you think about how many people die from influenza now globally, it is still more than corona, but it's a known devil and we have a vaccine. So in some ways in the Western world, you look at when it hits you, it becomes news, right? It's the same thing like I was on UNESCO for many years, and I remember people from the Pacific Islands used to be talking about, and the smaller islands always talking about climate change and how their livelihood, because their global warming would lift the waters up. But it never made international news till it took a European white teenager, Greta Thunberg, to start talking about it, and suddenly it's massive. And I think to some degree it's like this. I mean, how many people even think millions die a year from malaria, millions die a year from TB? We're not talking about it simply because we don't have it in our Western countries.
Wow.
So I think till as humanity, we start looking at us as an entire ecosystem, and all of us have to have the same kind of little bit of balanced life. Till then, if we don't do that, and we have power concentrated in 45 individuals, wealth concentrated in 45 individuals, I think this is the recipe we end up with. So if I take New Zealand, for example, this is interesting. I was saying to somebody, we lose 500 people a year to the flu. Yes, they're older people, mostly with pre-existing similar to this. But if you look at COVID, we've had 20 deaths, but every single death's been reported and it's made the news. And this is where I'm talking about the anxiety gene, right? So what I mean is this flu, the regular flu, which is now considered, no one's even talking about it, and we're coming into a winter, kills 500 a year. And this is the same flu which was the Spanish flu in 1918, except it doesn't kill thousands as it did, then it just mellows down. And eventually, this will be around for a while, but it will mellow down and it will be just another virus. So I think that's the future of it eventually. In between, the strategies would be one option: if a vaccine may work, may not work. But the other option is more likely what we'll have sooner is drugs to treat it. Because already they're trying the drugs which were used for Ebola and various other drugs, remdesivir and various antiviral drugs. And I think eventually, if you don't have a vaccine, you may have a drug you can take, like an antiviral, which will reduce the severity. So I think that will be faster. And I think eventually the virus will mellow down. So every pandemic, like if you did nothing, you just did nothing and you just broke all the rules, stayed outside, it'll kill a large number of the population, but it's not going to kill all of you or all of us, because the virus does not, it's not stupid, right? So it doesn't think that's it. So this is what I was saying. That's why the mutations, when somebody studied the genomic mutations in Asia Pacific, was different to China, was different to Europe, was different to the US. But the mutation also seems to be related, the severity of the virulence is related to the population density as well. So that's why New York has it much worse than some other cities, or London has it much worse than some other cities. And if you look at Italy, Lombardy, Milan is one of the most densely populated. So that's why they were affected. But if you look like other places, it's not so much.
So Sharad, if this is inevitable as it is, and if there's not going to be a vaccine anytime soon,
there may be, but it won't be quick and easy as we think. Yeah.
It won't be quick and easy. And you're saying maybe the medication would perhaps be the easiest solution. Going back to the big $1 million question, well, the $1 trillion question is because of the impact today that you're seeing in the economy. And if you look at what Trump has been saying, or the impact, say, in places like India or Italy, etc., what would your advice be to governments in terms of the best way to be able to tackle this? Lockdown, or periods of lockdown and slow opening up, or open up but make sure that you have all of the protocol in place, which is physical distancing and ensuring that you are in a hygienic space?
I think part of the reason for lockdowns is because as human beings, like, we're not enlightened, not intuitive, and we're too easy to believe misinformation. So like I was saying, the playbook of pandemics was the same from in the plague. It was the same in the Justinian plague in 541 AD. So the point is that people, it was the same: keep away from people, don't spread saliva or spread that kind of stuff, and then wash your hands. Now, the thing is, if people distance themselves, did all these things, we probably won't have as much spread. But the problem is when you tell that to people, people aren't going to listen. So governments take the extreme step. But let me just give you, this is always an interesting argument, because I guess you've got to step it back from one level to say, this is a battle between the health and the economy, and the health of the economy. So let me give you, there's an interesting thing is, and it fundamentally becomes almost a political discourse between managed care medicine. See, managed care medicine, which manages pandemics the best, is almost like your socialism, isn't it? Because if you were ultra-capitalistic, the US, then what happens is, well before this started, all of us were worried about the US. We knew they were going to have the highest death rate simply because they have massive disparity, and they have a large population of people who don't have access to healthcare. They have a large population of people who live in crowded surroundings. You know straight away that African Americans were going to get affected disproportionately. So you could see all that. You didn't need to be a crystal ball gazer. But if you looked at the places which did well, they were the places which have more managed care, like here where primary health care is very good. So for example, let me example. In New Zealand, if I deal with cancers all the time. So if a patient had an advanced cancer, we may have one drug available when Americans may have 4. Right. So we accept the fact that, we may not do as well as an American would do, but we'll take what we can allocate for health. But that way, everybody gets the same care, be he the richest guy or be he the poorest guy. But our economies have been ultra-capitalistic, right? So in other words, same in India, it's massive disparity. But our societies have also moved to this extreme disparity. So for example, if you think about it, say social media has all the characteristic of a virus. It mutates, it spreads. It's exactly like if you think of Corona, that's social media. And, it gives rise to little new viruses. You can see Facebook gave rise to WhatsApp and few other things. It is exactly like it. But also, if you think about it, the biggest danger for us is at the moment, something like 45 individuals have the same amount of wealth as everyone else in the world. And most of them are in IT. And what's scary is if you think about the tech industry, yes, it's done a lot of good, but the interesting thing is it's disconnected, which means people are, but it makes the world interconnected. And what it means is you have long supply chains, you have less goods, and there's less manufacturing everywhere. And it's a perfect recipe how not to deal with the pandemic because of this infrastructure of the internet and social media. What it means is the supply chains can all be like in China or in India. Everyone else relies on them. They rely on everyone else for better technology. And if something happens that you cannot have the supply chains going, everything falls apart. So part of the reason we have much more of an economic impact that we even have to talk about this is because of the fundamental construct of our economies now is, for the Western world, pretty much everything is manufactured in China, or to a lesser degree, places like India. And then for them, the real serious innovation doesn't come from them. They basically just copy what comes out of somewhere else or try and steal. So what you find is that there's a core group which designs stuff and innovates. Everybody's linked up. There's one manufacturing hub and everyone else is just consumers, right? And I think the problem with that model is it's not equal. So each country is not having a balance between their manufacturing supply chain as they used to in the past. So one of the reasons is so we're not equipped to deal with pandemics because pandemics are as old as time itself. And the way we're moving is totally inorganic. So humans evolved organically. But what we're talking about, every time I go to Silicon Valley, what are we talking about? We're talking about artificial intelligence, putting colonies on Mars. That's not normal. And everybody I meet talking genomics says, all the research is how can we live till 120, 130. The fact of the matter is, I don't want to live that long. But what I mean is even those who do, there is a limit to finite life, and it's about 150. Whatever we do, we may be able to extend our lifespan to that, but beyond it, we won't. So the point is, everything we're trying to do is actually inorganic. So we're forgetting that we and the viruses, which are part of us, all evolved organically. And I think that's where the real... So people don't think, we're not intuitive. So we're not thinking industrialized farming, that's a recipe for pandemics. So people may think short-sighted. They may think, okay, let me just stop eating meat. Pandemics are gone. People take maybe a religious view sometimes. But interestingly, in Malaysia, when they banned, Singapore stopped, when the Nipah virus hit, they stopped Malaysian pork. And then Malaysia banned it for a while simply because but what they found is the bats were eating the fruit which was around the pig farms. So even in India, so bats are necessary to pollinate things like mangoes and lychees and avocados. So if you didn't have bats, you wouldn't have mangoes. So would you be able to tell an Indian to give up a mango? I don't know. So these are all bigger questions.
I'm going to close with something that you said, going back to, how we have grown organically. So fear, because of our scaredy cat gene, as you said, or anxiety, seems to be the sort of controlling factor. So the question I'm posing to you is that the response of most governments has been to take stringent action or to follow us and ensure that they know exactly what we're doing, where and how and which, etc. Do you feel that then that is the way forward, to instill fear and therefore get us to toe the line to be able to defeat the vaccine, defeat the virus?
I think the problem, I have deep concerns. There's one part of using it for this, but as you see what's happening in Hungary and various places around the world and many other governments is, politicians or governments fundamentally want control. They want to know where everybody is. They want to know how they can get your vote. So my concern is really about what I'm calling now underskin surveillance. So till now, we're already monitored a lot by cameras, right? So if you go anywhere in England, you see a camera looking at you, most parts of the world. So that's been always, as a skin person, I always like to think of things above skin and under skin. So that's been your above skin surveillance. We've always been surveilled. But now it's going to a dangerous degree because it's in these apps, they're trying to monitor your temperatures, your things, so various things. So people soon will start knowing how you're feeling, how you're thinking. Do you like them? Don't you like them? Which they already know from the other virus, which is the social media. So I actually think it's quite dangerous because I really think, I don't actually believe overall, all things said and done, while social media is really useful, helps us all connect. It's like a virus. You have to realize that it's not fundamentally a force for good. It's fundamentally something which connects us all just like a virus does, but it's fundamentally not a force for good, but like a virus, it's probably can mellow and last for a long time, but we have to be sensible. But going back to the scaredy cat thing we said, you must remember when humans left Africa, life was so dangerous. 1 in 20 were killed by predators, but we live in the safest of times within our society. So really, I think the scaredy cat gene to some degree got replaced with, or got balanced on the other side by too much of an optimism gene. And that's why possibly why we don't even foretell anything. We can't foretell. It was not in anybody's vision a pandemic was coming. Whereas people like me, we were always saying, it was not a question of if, but when. We were thinking, when is the next one? This is not the last one. We're going to have another one from another. And they're pretty much 6 out of 10 are usually zoonoses, which means they always come from animals because they're the closest to us. We've got to get it from some animal. Even HIV came from chimps. People were eating chimps, so from chimpanzees, the virus had jumped over. And the chimps, interestingly, originally got it because they were killing and eating another monkey themselves. So it's like we have to just realize the risks, but be prepared.
Dr. Sharad Paul, that was absolutely fascinating, and may your and my scaredy cat genes sort of prevail as opposed to our optimistic gene, and we stay safe. Please stay safe in New Zealand, and if possible, if you can export Jacinta Ardern to the rest of the world, or at least her gene of being a good manager, I think it'll help all of us. But thank you so much for speaking to us at JLF's Brave New World, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. It was excellent.
That was fabulous, and thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. And I'm sorry we couldn't take any of the questions. What we will do is we'll send your questions to Dr. Sharad Paul, and we'll get him to post it back onto our Facebook channel. So please look out for the answers from Dr. Sharad Paul. We thank our official radio partner, Red FM, Bajate Raho. Please do remember to log in at 9 p.m. for our next session, Ottolenghi's Lockdown Kitchen. With his fabulous restaurants and best-selling Ottolenghi cookbooks, Yotam Ottolenghi has established himself as one of the most exciting talents in the world of cookery and food writing. Here he talks to award-winning food writer and chef Ravindra Bhogal about his life and work and what we should be cooking to keep sane during lockdown. Now, for all of you who can stay locked down, we have a special sequence from the Jaipur Music Stage archives. Pandit Shubhendru Rao and Saskia Rao Dahas. Pandit Shubhendru Rao is an internationally acclaimed performer, composer, cultural entrepreneur, and music educator. A protege of Pandit Ravi Shankar, Shubhendru Rao has performed at major music festivals and prestigious concert halls across the world. He is accompanied by Saskia Rao Dahas, world-renowned virtuoso cellist and composer on the cello. In this extract, they celebrate the centenary of his guru's birth year in a performance that showcases the collaborative elements of his legacy. Enjoy and see you back at 9 p.m.